Welcome to Aspen Leading Edge. I'm Patty Roberts from St. Mary's University School of Law. Today I have two guests with me. One is Betsy Schmidt. She is a Senior Research Fellow for the School of Public Policy at UMass Amherst, also the president of an organization called Rules of the Road for Nonprofit, and Professor of Law Alan Madison, who is at the University of South Dakota Knudson School of Law. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Hello.
I'm very happy to have you here so that we can talk about some of your work in the nonprofit sector. Betsy, you and I knew each other back in our William and Mary days, and you've been doing nonprofit law now for a long time, teaching students the ins and outs of it. And so I know that you wrote Nonprofit Law, The Charitable Life of a Charitable Organization, originally, the first two editions. So why don't you tell our readers, our listeners, and our readers, what prompted you to write the book, and when did you start down this path?
Well, I actually started down this path in probably late 90s when I became general counsel for GuideStar. And that was in Williamsburg, Virginia. And I had also had a relationship with William and Mary. And I realized very quickly that GuideStar couldn't afford to make legal mistakes. And so I worked with William and Mary to teach a course there on nonprofit law and learned it very quickly that way. I was also obviously learning it on the job at GuideStar. And I realized I was coming at it from the point of view of a nonprofit leader, not from the point of view of a tax professor, which is how most people in the academic world come to this subject. And so I didn't find the traditional case books or the existing case books that helpful. So I just started doing my own. And pretty soon I had a book. I got it published.
That's great. So you had your first two editions, and then you did bring someone who comes at it from the tax perspective. How did you and Professor Madison cross paths and start on the third edition together?
Well, I started using the book, I think it was in the later years of the first edition. And then during the second edition, the way I started using it was I was going to be teaching nonprofits for the first time. And I had a research assistant look through all of the different books. And she said basically what Betsy said is that all these books are very technical oriented, and this might be better for this one, Betsy's, might be better for our students. And so I started using it. The students liked it. I liked it. And then Betsy was looking for a co-author, and I joined the fray, I guess, so to speak. So that's been my experience. I don't have any nonprofit experience. I think I helped a couple people start a nonprofit. That's about it.
Well, and I find that even if you're not going to do something like go be general counsel for GuideStar, so many of us will end up on boards. Lawyers are typically asked to join boards and be kind of some of the legal perspective in that role. So is this the kind of book that sets students up for their post-graduation practice in nonprofit law, but also for that kind of board service?
Absolutely. I tell my students that what I expect them to get from this is the idea of, we're used to spotting issues, and a situation comes up and you go, there's an issue. I'm on a board, there's an issue. And that's incredibly helpful for board members to have. I do tell my students that every one of them should be on a board sometime in their lives. And I've had experience when I was general counsel for GuideStar. We were actually working with the AOL Foundation, and they were using their corporate lawyers at first. And their corporate lawyers, I was surprised to realize that, their corporate lawyers didn't know as much as I knew. And I made enough objections of what was happening that they brought in nonprofit lawyers. It really is different from corporate law. So it's good for students to have an understanding of nonprofit law.
So now this is the fourth edition. The second one you all have authored together came out this fall through Aspen, Nonprofit Law, The Charitable Life of a Charitable Organization. And what is different about the fourth edition for those who are considering whether or not to adopt it after using it prior editions, or even just for those who are thinking, well, this would be a cool book to use as I teach these skills to my students?
Well, we try to keep it up to date. One of the strengths of this book is it brings in examples from every aspect of society. And it didn't go to press until after President Trump was in office, and we were even able to put into the preface that there was one big beautiful bill. So we're very up to date, but we bring in examples like from the National Rifle Association, things that have come up in the last 5 years that have made a big difference. And we also have seen some of the issues that have come up since the book went to press. We saw them ahead of time. So there are questions in the notes about things like, how do you know whether someone who is investigating a politically active nonprofit is doing it for political motives or is actually seeing fraud? Not that you would know, but we have that as a discussion question that, how should students react to that? How should politically active nonprofits protect themselves? So those type of issues are already in the book. We also put in a couple of new cases. Alan added something about the Feeding the Future scandal in Minnesota, which...
Wow, that's very current.
Yeah, New York Times had something this week on it. So we were aware of that. That's what happens. Some of these things that become really big in the press, we're so on top of it that we knew about it ahead of time.
So I wonder if you can speak to that a little bit. I mean, what should the students who are teaching take away from this scandal that's being reported by nonprofits in Minnesota?
One of the things I hope they take away is that this is highly unusual. My students often end up thinking that all nonprofits are crooks, and that really does not happen. But this is a good place where we should talk about how much regulation do you need, what's too much regulation. We have that tension in our government that it often seems like these rules are set up to make it harder for the good guys, and the bad guys still get away with it. So, I mean, at least in this case, the people were caught. There's something like 59 people already in jail, but students should be aware that people occasionally use the halo effect of nonprofits to dupe people into thinking that they're doing the right thing. And sometimes they aren't. So we have to keep our eyes open.
It seems like part of the reason that you do end up with some fraud is that in some ways, it seems like the rules are set up assuming that people are in the nonprofit world are going to be good people. And it just turns out to sometimes not be the case. Although there isn't a lot of fraud in the nonprofit world, when it does happen, it's one of the things that makes a lot of legal fields interesting, like securities regulation, nonprofit law, and tax law. A lot of the really interesting stuff is the fraud, but in all cases, it's a very small percentage of what's happening in that field. But it makes it interesting.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, I'm on a board and I chair the audit committee and the governance committee, and I'm married to an auditor. So like internal controls, I can see where in nonprofits, internal controls may not be kind of a primary framework through which they look at setting up books and setting up processes and things like that. Not my nonprofit. They're doing a great job.
It obviously depends on the organization. I do think there's this survey done a few years ago that said more nonprofits, well, they're more concerned about raising money. Maybe it's that than the internal controls or the mission. So, we have to put all that into balance. But we have a chapter on accountability in this book. I also have recently written a book called Rules of the Road for Nonprofits, Using the Law to Achieve Your Mission. And my point in that book is that we can translate the law more affirmatively. All law is pretty much written in don't, and that paralyzes some nonprofit leaders. So I have 8 in that book, 8 precepts, and one of them is complete the paperwork. And really, if you don't do that and you're not doing your internal controls, you're going to not be able to fulfill your mission. I mean, the most frequent way for nonprofits, I'm sure all nonprofit professors who are listening to this know this, but the most easy way to lose your exemption is to not file your Form 990 for 3 years in a row. So it really is that is an important detail.
So I noticed in reading a description of the book that some of the things you've included are donor-advised funds, threats from politicians to end tax exemption, issues related to hospitals, property taxes, and NIL. And the latter was most surprising to me. So how does that come into nonprofit law?
Well, NIL is name, image, and likeness in college sports. And a lot of booster clubs have been trying, and some of them actually succeeded in saying that these clubs were 501c3 charities. But really, the IRS, and I think most lawyers and law professors would agree, they're set up for the benefit of the students. And, a charity has to be set up for the benefit of the public, not individuals. So they shouldn't be 501c3s. People are still trying to find ways to make them be that. So we'll see.
One thing, it's not in your description, but I wonder if you've covered or you have any opinions about, there's been some talk recently about how maybe some of these mega churches shouldn't have 501c3 protection. Any thoughts on that, or do you address that in the book?
Well, we have a Supreme Court case that says they should. So yes, this is an interesting topic. The religion and nonprofit area is particularly interesting right now. And the last part of Section 501c3 is about being involved in 501c3 organizations cannot be involved in politics, can't endorse or challenge, say that they don't want a particular candidate. And some churches have said that's unconstitutional. Actually, it's more than just churches, but mostly it's been churches who have been saying this is stopping our freedom of speech. That issue is being litigated. The Trump administration actually wants to settle a lawsuit on that. There was an argument this week on it. We'll see. This part of 501c3 may change. If it changes, at least with this settlement, it would only be with regard to that jurisdiction and churches, which is awfully hard to enforce anyway. So that wouldn't make that big a difference, but that area is really challenging right now. And our teacher's manual also will keep this type of stuff up to date. So that's one of the other strengths of this book, I believe, the teacher's manual.
That's terrific. So, Alan, coming from the tax side of things, do you have any thoughts about all of the attention being paid to the endowments of higher education institutions and how that all fits in current 501c3 and nonprofit law regulations?
I guess I don't really know. The universities have massive endowments, and they have them because they hire financial wizards from Wall Street that are investing very well, and they do much better than the amount that they have to pay out. And I think that's just the way the system works. And I don't know that I necessarily have any objection to that. I don't know if Betsy does.
Well, in our book, we ask the students to consider that question. And in the teacher's manual, we would then suggest several answers to it. We try to stay objective all the way through. Personally, as someone who has worked for nonprofits that need money quickly, I would like to see the money get more quickly into what I call working nonprofits, but I wouldn't do it by taxing them because then the money goes to the government. I would do it by giving a partial deduction to money that goes to endowments and foundations and donor-advised funds, and the full deduction would come when it actually went all the way into a working organization. I haven't done enough research. I want some other law professor to do the research on that to see if that's feasible. I mean, I know there are people thinking like that. There was a suggested a legislation that was introduced during the Biden administration that didn't go anywhere that started going along those lines. So there are people thinking about it, but I don't know exactly how it would work. I just know it would certainly help the working nonprofits if some of this money got to them faster.
Absolutely. Well, that's terrific that you're asking these kinds of very contemporary questions in the book for students. For the fourth edition of Nonprofit Law, The Charitable Life of a Charitable Organization, what would you say are the top 3 pieces of advice you give to the law students taking the course for how they should approach creation of a nonprofit or representing a nonprofit?
I always start my course by telling them this is going to be the shortest course you ever take. The answer is don't. I mean, one of the pieces of advice is really think long and hard before you actually create a nonprofit. The book is done through the life cycle as an example of these are the issues that come up during the lifetime, but there are usually other organizations doing the work.
Well, let me stop you there and follow up. You said my advice is usually don't create a nonprofit. Why is that?
Well, I think most people haven't thought it through enough. They come up with an idea and they go, I'm starting a nonprofit. And they don't realize that it really should take years of thinking and finding out who else is doing the work, how easy it will or hard. It's never easy to raise money. There's just so much that is involved in creating and running a nonprofit that most people don't understand. I think by the time they finish this course, they do, but it's really hard work. I sometimes think that people underestimate how hard it is. You have so many stakeholders. There's never enough money. It's difficult, but it's worth it once if you get through all of those things and you realize there's room for what you want to do. Also, you could start with a fiscal sponsorship and test it out with somebody else doing the back office for you. I often recommend that too.
One of the issues is that when someone starts a nonprofit, in order to really do a good job, they have to take ownership of it, of the project. But nonprofits don't have owners. And so they could put in all this work and then be excluded from the organization by way of governance. And so I guess that's kind of a huge issue, I would think. And if you think about it in terms of ownership, that's sort of a defining thing about nonprofits is that they don't have any owners. That issue kind of flows through the whole book. In a sense, it kind of underlines all of the, not all of the issues, but a huge number of issues that come up. Just the fact that it doesn't have owners. And people that are starting a nonprofit don't really think about that.
We have a wonderful case in there where there were only 3 people on the board of this organization, and 2 of them wanted to get rid of the, I think, founder. And they chase each other throughout the town because the founder keeps trying to avoid having a quorum. They had to have all 3 of them for a quorum. And they finally kick him out at the bank. And then there's a lawsuit over whether that was a valid meeting. So,
oh my goodness, that's quite something.
And Elon Musk contributed a whole bunch of money to OpenAI and thought that he could, because he did that he could control it. And he found out that that was not the case at all.
Yeah, and we have OpenAI in this casebook too, which is a fascinating nonprofit case because it's switched from being a nonprofit to a for-profit. And the question is, are nonprofit rules strong enough to keep that profit motive away?
So when that happens, not-for-profit becomes for-profit, what happens to the funds that they got the benefit of non-taxed status? If it transitions into that for-profit, do those funds have to be kept separate? Are they then taxable? How does that work?
They have to stay in the charitable stream. And I haven't been following minute by minute since we finished this book. They have switched to a benefit corporation, but there still is a 501c3 and all that money still has to be used for charity. And this is also something that I will be sure is up to date when the teacher's manual gets finished.
Well, it's been a big fall for you both. One, because Nonprofit Law, The Charitable Life of a Charitable Organization, 4th edition was published, but also, Betsy, for you to have a second book. You mentioned the Georgetown University Press book, Rules of the Road for Nonprofits, Nonprofit Law for Non-Lawyers. Would there be a benefit for law students to use both books?
Well, of course, I think so. The second book is written for nonprofit leaders, actually, the board members that they might all become, but it's framed differently, organized slightly differently, uses a lot of the same cases. So I think that the 2 books would work hand in hand if students wanted to use them. If I were a law professor, I would only assign the Aspen book, though. That's the one that is meant for law students.
And as we look at the horizon in the next 6 months to a year with all of these contemporary issues we've talked about in nonprofit law, what do you think is the biggest change likely to come down the pike for nonprofits?
I think what is happening is the rhetoric has changed, the policy has changed, the law has not changed. Nonprofits right now are understandably jittery. They've lost, something like 60% of nonprofits have lost federal or government funding. We're hearing threats to organizations from the administration. So it's time of fear, but it's also a time, the nonprofit sector has always been really resilient. The nonprofit leaders are used to working without enough money. I believe that if they can keep their heads straight and use the tools that we already have, the nonprofit tools we already have, we'll come out different. But it will be okay.
All right. Well, as long as we're looking into the future, let's conclude by asking both of you what your predictions are for the future of legal education in the coming decade. How do you think that it might change?
I haven't taught law students for quite some time, so I'll just say my wish. My wish is that it would be practical and get students out of law school ready to do the work, which I certainly was not ready when I graduated from law school. So many more clinics, or I'd even love to see a Khan Academy type thing for all of the bar review courses, and then students work together with maybe even simulations to come up with, let's say a huge toxic environmental case that has environmental things and criminal and tort and contracts and intellectual property all in one thing, and have the students work that way. That would be my desire. But Alan, you're in the field more than I am, so you can say what you think.
I think there's a lot of fear about AI taking over the field, but I don't think that it will. I think that it'll become a great tool, but it has a long way to go before it can be relied on for legal advice. And I don't think the AI companies want to be in the business of their AIs providing legal advice. So I think law schools have to learn AI, but I don't think they need to fear it, if that makes sense. And that's going to be kind of on people's minds for a few years, I think.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Well said. Well, thank you both, and congratulations again on Aspen's book, Nonprofit Law, The Charitable Life of a Charitable Organization, 4th edition. We've enjoyed hearing from Betsy Schmidt and Alan Madison. If you enjoyed this conversation and want to listen to additional thought leaders in the Academy, you can find more Aspen Leading Edge podcast episodes on the website or on your favorite podcast channels. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.